So here's our second segment on really basic introductory stuff in economics. And you can see that we're going to build on those fundamental assumptions and talk about some initial results. And again, we have our four different textbook authors here. And we're looking across the columns here. And within each row, you can see that they all emphasize the idea of trade. And the idea that when we have people making mutually consenting trades, that we expect them to be able to realize some gains. And you can see here that everyone, again, is a big fan of that. And I think economists are much more optimistic about the idea of mutually beneficial trade than the average member of the public, and there's a lot of sort of survey evidence of that. In particular, economists are very optimistic about the benefits of international trade as compared to the general public. And later in the course, we'll see why that is. So because of that, because economists generally think that mutually consenting trade is mutually beneficial, economists are generally pretty sympathetic to the idea of using markets to organize economic activity. And here I'm going to slow down a little bit, and we'll see that sort of the different authors have expressed this in different ways. And here's where we start sort of opening up some differences between them. And you can see that Krugman, say, for instance, divides this into sort of three sub-claims. One is that markets move towards equilibrium. We'll cover the idea of equilibrium in a fair amount of detail later, but for now, equilibrium is sort of a state of rest or a state of stability here. And the idea here is that, well, markets will move to a sort of price here where, due to the laws of supply and demand, the amount that people want to buy at that price and the amount that people want to sell at that price is basically equal. And we can go ahead and see that coming about in many markets. And when we have forces that keep the laws of supply and demand from causing that equilibrium to happen here, then we're going to end up with persistent shortages or surpluses here. So that's what Baumol and Blinder are getting at here. Another way of thinking about this is when we try to prohibit a market, so we try to prohibit the market in illegal drugs or something like that. Markets are very powerful. They don't always do exactly what we would want, but they're kind of like the ocean or like fire. They're very powerful things. And if we attempt to sort of swim against the current, then we may end up with some unintended consequences, and the markets may just sort of exist even though we are attempting to suppress them. We can see that Krugman sort of goes, okay, let's go ahead and build on this. We have this idea that markets move towards equilibrium, and Krugman asserts that resources should be used as efficiently as possible to achieve society's goals. And at this point, I want to introduce a distinction here between what we call positive statements or positive analysis and normative statements or normative analysis here. And the idea here is that a positive statement or positive analysis is when an economist is functioning purely as sort of a social scientist, trying to function as just a social scientist. And so we're trying to limit ourselves to statements of cause and effect or statements of fact when we're engaged in positive analysis. So remember, positive analysis is a statement of alleged fact, a claim about facts. It might be wrong. So if I say the sky is yellow today, I'm claiming something about facts. It's wrong, but it's a testable hypothesis. It's a claim about the world's factual nature, as opposed to it's a good thing that the sky is blue. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, but I'm expressing a value judgment, and that's what we call a normative opinion, or a normative statement as a value judgment. So you can see here that resources should be used as efficiently as possible to achieve society's goals. That's going to be an example of a normative statement, because we're saying that Well, society's goals are important and worth achieving. Maybe there are some societies that have goals that are bad, and maybe it's bad if those societies use their resources efficiently to pursue their goals. So, this is a normative assertion. Now, it may be an uncontroversial one, but it is a normative assertion here. Likewise, a little bit less obviously, markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. This is also a normative assertion. A judgment about what is good and what is bad is a normative judgment. It's a value judgment, right? So this statement here, I might, if I were going to write this textbook, I might rephrase this as markets are usually an efficient way to organize economic activity. Because we'll come to the idea later of efficiency. Efficiency tries to measure the size of the economic pie, not whether or not it's a tasty pie or an attractive pie or a pie that's fairly divided. And the size of the pie is something that we can attempt to measure on a sort of social scientific basis without getting into value judgments. So, likewise over here, good incentives align self-interest with the social interest. That is also going to be a normative statement here. So you can see that when we start to grapple with this idea of are markets a good thing or a bad thing, we're getting into the territory of normative statements. And that's okay. We ultimately want to be able to use what we know about social scientific facts to make normative decisions and judgments. Because whenever we're going to go out there and do an action, to go act in the world and achieve something, then we have to bring our values into it. But we want to make sure we know when we're talking about facts and when we're talking about value judgments. Because it may be that we can settle disagreements about facts with more evidence, but disagreements about value judgments, we start getting into squishier issues of sort of philosophy and politics and religion and that sort of thing. And those are very different sorts of arguments to make, and they can't be solved with facts alone. So we want to go ahead and make sure we maintain that distinction. So Krugman sort of builds on all of this and says, well, we think that because markets move to equilibrium, and because they allow most mutually beneficial trades to occur, that markets usually lead to efficiency. And, sort of all else equal, we think efficiency is good. All else equal, it's better to have a bigger economic pie rather than a smaller one. There's a lot hidden in that all else equal statement, but generally, probably most people would agree with that. So that's sort of the basis why someone like Mankiw is making this statement over here, that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. He just sort of makes it in a blanket way. Krugman delves into it a little bit more. And Cohen and Tabarrok essentially believe that markets align self-interest with the social interest. You can see that Baumol and Blinder are actually a little bit more agnostic. They're more sort of just like, well, if you try to go against the market, bad things will happen, as opposed to markets tend to produce good things. At the end of the day, however, the argument is much the same, that markets are probably the least bad, at least, way to organize economic activity under most circumstances.